The 22nd of June, 1941, the Soviet Union. Hitler's armies launch Operation Barbarossa, crossing the Soviet border in the largest land invasion in history. Within days, the Red Army begins to collapse at alarming speed as entire formations are surrounded, supply lines crumble, and Soviet command structures fall into chaos. Within weeks, German forces advance deep into Soviet territory, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and destroying whole mechanized corps. The catastrophe is not only the result of German military superiority, but also a fatal weakness inside the Soviet Union, a weakness created not by external enemies, but by Joseph Stalin himself. 4 years earlier, in 1937, he unleashes a purge that destroys the leadership of the Red Army, eliminating most experienced commanders and military thinkers. In a staged, secret trial, 8 of the most prominent Soviet generals, led by Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, are accused of treason and executed, leaving the Soviet Union defenseless on the eve of its greatest war. The roots of the case stretched back to the early years of the Soviet regime. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the Red Army had been built by men who combined revolutionary flame with professional skill, often drawn from the former Imperial Officer Corps. Among them, Mikhail Tukhachevsky stood out as one of the most brilliant minds. Born in 1893 into a minor noble family, he had served as an officer in the Tsar's army, spent time as a prisoner of war in Germany during the First World War, and returned to Russia in time to join the Bolsheviks. During the Russian Civil War, he rose rapidly, commanding armies against the anti-revolutionary forces, and later leading Soviet invasion during the Polish-Soviet War, which ended for the Soviets in disaster after successful Polish defense of Warsaw. His boldness, intellect, and belief in mechanized warfare made him one of the architects of the modern Red Army. To the world, he embodied the new Soviet military elite, young, educated, and loyal to the Bolshevik Revolution. His brilliance was also evident in the fact that he was one of the first marshals of the Soviet Union, the highest rank that one could achieve in the Red Army in that time. Yet loyalty meant little in Stalin's Soviet Union. By the 1930s, the dictator's obsession with control had reached pathological levels, and purges were spreading through the Communist Party, the secret police, and the state bureaucracy. Anyone who held independent authority was viewed with suspicion. The army, with its millions of armed men and its popular commanders, terrified Stalin more than any political faction. He had long resented the prestige of the military and the independence of men like Tukhachevsky, whom he regarded as potential Bonapartes, generals who could one day turn their armies against him and against revolution. The campaign of destruction began slowly. In the mid-1920s, Leon Trotsky, the founder of the Red Army, was removed from his post as Commissar for War and later went into exile. His supporters within the army were systematically dismissed or arrested. Former Tsarist officers who had been tolerated for their expertise were purged in the early 1930s under the so-called Former Officers' Plot or Operation Vyesna. Thousands of officers were expelled, imprisoned, accused of espionage for foreign powers, or sabotage and executed. Then, in 1936 and 1937, as the Great Terror intensified, Stalin and his chief of the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, Nikolai Yezhov, turned their attention to the rest of the officer corps. The plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the highest political organ in the Soviet Union, in February and March 1937, marked the turning point. There, Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's loyal ally, declared that wreckers and traitors had infiltrated the Red Army and must be rooted out. It was a signal to the secret police that the purge inside the army was to begin. Within months, leading officers were summoned to Moscow, questioned, and arrested. The net closed around Tukhachevsky, who was at that time Deputy Commissar of Defense and widely regarded as the army's most gifted strategist. This soon changed. On the 22nd of May, 1937, Tukhachevsky was arrested. Just before his arrest, he was appointed military commander of the Volga military district. Shortly after departing to take up his new command, he was secretly detained and brought back to Moscow in a prison van. At the same time, Generals Yona Yakir, Yerony Mubarevich, Robert Eidman, August Kork, Witold Putna, Boris Feldman, and Vitaly Primakov were seized in their districts or summoned under false pretenses and arrested. All of them were accused of forming a Trotskyist anti-Soviet military organization, allegedly plotting to overthrow Stalin and seize power in the Soviet Union with the help of Nazi Germany. The charges were based on forced confessions extracted under torture and on forged documents prepared by the NKVD. For years, it was believed that these forgeries had originated in Nazi Germany. After the Second World War, rumors spread that the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, had fabricated documents implicating Tukhachevsky and others in espionage, hoping to destabilize the Soviet military. According to this theory, the papers had been passed through various intermediaries, including Edvard Beneš, the president of Czechoslovakia, to Stalin, who had believed them. But when the Soviet archives were opened after 1991, the truth emerged. It had been Stalin himself who ordered the NKVD to invent the conspiracy. One of their agents, Nikolai Skoblin, was instructed to leak false intelligence to the Germans, knowing that their security services would amplify and return it, giving Stalin a plausible pretext for purging his generals. The deception was self-created and self-confirming, and in this was it created a perfect circle of paranoia. In their prison cells in Moscow, the generals were beaten, humiliated, and forced to sign confessions. Tukhachevsky, who had once lectured foreign officers on the future of armored warfare, was reduced to a broken man. His torture was directly supervised by NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov. Witnesses later testified that Tukhachevsky had been tortured for days, his face disfigured, his spirit crushed. His blood-stained and signed confession reached Stalin and confirmed the fictitious plot inside the army. With this paper evidence in hand, the dictator ordered the trial to proceed. The military tribunal met in secret on the 11th of June 1937 in the presence of the highest-ranking officers of the Soviet Union. Among the judges were several marshals of the Soviet Union, Semyon Budyonny, Vasily Blyukher, and Alexander Yegorov, heroes of the Russian Civil War and Tukhachevsky's colleagues. None of them dared to question the charges orchestrated by Stalin and the NKVD. Vasily Ulrich, Stalin's trusted judge and master of the Soviet show trials, presided the tribunal. The proceedings lasted only a few hours. There was no defense counsel, no cross-examination, and no witnesses. The sentence of the court-martial was death by shooting, and just a few hours after the midnight on the 12th of June 1937, all 8 men were executed by the shot in the head. When the official announcement of the trial appeared in public, accusing the famous generals of betraying the Soviet Union, public accepted it with disbelief, fear, and cautious silence. Within the army, the shock was devastating. Tukhachevsky and his colleagues had been among the architects of the modern Soviet military. Their execution signaled to every officer that loyalty and competence offered no protection against Stalin's will and madness, and soon after the executions, the wave of terror continued. Of the first 5 Soviet marshals, 3 were killed in the purges. Thousands of colonels and captains were arrested, interrogated, or dismissed from the army, and the officer corps was gutted. Even those who had condemned Tukhachevsky and his colleagues soon fell victim themselves. Marshal Vasily Blyukher died under interrogation when Lavrenti Beria blinded him, and Marshal Alexander Yegorov was executed in 1939. Only Semyon Budyonny and Boris Shapashnikov survived the killings. The purge was not only focused on generals, but rapidly spread through the ranks of the army. By the end of 1938, more than 30,000 officers and commissars had been dismissed from the Red Army, and more than 10,000 were arrested by the NKVD. The motives behind the Tukhachevsky case remained debated for decades. Some speculated that Stalin had acted out of genuine fear, that he had believed his generals were plotting against him. Others, and later Soviet archival research confirmed this, argued that the purge was simply an act of political consolidation, part of Stalin's broader campaign to eliminate all potential rivals. Tukhachevsky's reputation, popularity, and independent thinking had made him dangerous in Stalin's eyes. To destroy him and circle of his comrades and colleagues was to destroy the last institution capable of challenging Stalin's authority in the Soviet Union. For decades, the names of Tukhachevsky and his comrades were officially forgotten. They were erased from official histories, their portraits removed from military academies, their writings banned. Only after Stalin's death in 1953 did the truth begin to re-emerge. In 1957, under Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization, the 8 generals were formally rehabilitated. The Soviet Supreme Court declared that their convictions had been based on the absence of any actual crime and on confessions obtained through physical violence. But it was too late for them and for millions of Soviet soldiers. The destruction of the Red Army's leadership had catastrophic consequences. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, its forces performed disastrously. Poor coordination, inadequate training, and inexperienced commanders led to staggering losses. More than 100,000 dead or missing against a vastly smaller Finnish army. 2 years later, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the effects of the purge were even more apparent. The Wehrmacht's rapid advance destroyed entire Soviet armies. The Soviet state had crippled its own defense, just as the greatest threat in its history appeared on its borders. The destruction of the Red Army's leadership in 1937 was more than a tragedy of individuals. It was a self-inflicted wound that changed the course of the 20th century. It weakened the Soviet Union in the face of Hitler's invasion and revealed the depths of Stalin's paranoia. Before we end today's story, take a look at worldhistory.tv, your special destination for true history lovers. Discover exclusive documentaries and incredible stories you won't find anywhere else. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.